Today we're going to be talking about something called Dada. Now technically, Dadaism is an art movement, but I like to think of it more as an idea or a state of mind. To put it briefly, Dada was the attempt to create something called anti-art. Art that rejected rationality and logic. Art that didn't align itself with ruling class values. This new idea, which was for some reason called Dada, went the 1916 version of viral. So today I'm going to tell you the story of Dada, a story that starts in Zurich during World War I and spreads halfway across the world. So without further ado, let's head over to Zurich. So the year was 1916. World War I was in full swing and artists and intellectuals from across Europe had fled to neutral Switzerland in a bid to escape the chaos and the destruction of the war. The Great War had taken its toll on everyone's mental health. People were angry, sad and grieving, and they felt lied to by their government. And it was in this context that the poets Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings decided to found the Cabaret Voltaire, which was basically evenings of art, poetry and just complete madness at the Café Odeon in Zurich. Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings were eccentric and deeply spiritual people. Hugo Ball would pull up to the Cabaret Voltaire dressed like this, and they'd both give these bizarre performances and readings. People were free to do basically whatever they wanted at the Cabaret Voltaire, and it would be considered art. And in the Cabaret Voltaire, all this anger and resentment that people were feeling was channeled into creativity. The evenings were pretty ruckus and they'd often end in rioting. And that's how Dada was born. No one knows where the name came from, and possibly that's why it stuck, because it didn't really mean anything. Shortly after the founding of the Cabaret Voltaire, this guy turns up in Zurich. His name is Tristan Tzara, and he was a Romanian poet. He was quite short, very charismatic, and he loved to be the centre of attention. It didn't take long for him to become a central member of the Dada movement that was emerging out of the Cabaret Voltaire. Tristan Tzara was inspired by the Futurists, and he was inspired by Marinetti in particular. If you've watched my video on Futurism, then you'll know that Marinetti was a fascist and that admiring the Futurists was a bit of a red flag. Anyway, the Futurists invented something called the Artist Manifesto, and they loved to make big speeches about the future of art. Tristan Tzara copied this element of Futurism and applied it to Dada. He started writing manifestos and making these grand speeches about anti-art and Dadaism at the Cabaret Voltaire. So the Zurich Dadaists wanted to reject art and rationality, which is pretty cool in theory, but this brought up the obvious question: what did they actually make? Jean Arp used chance and randomness as a way of bypassing logic. He would rip up bits of coloured paper and throw them on the floor. He'd stick them where they landed, and that would be his art. Hugo Ball invented something called phonetic poetry, which just means talking gibberish into a microphone and calling it poetry. Marcel Janco made these masks, which he got people to wear and perform in during the cabaret. These masks were problematic as they were appropriating African masks, and they played into certain stereotypes about Africans. The Dadaists may have been anti-establishment, but unfortunately they weren't the wokest bunch. Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings had got the ball rolling, but they were feeling unfulfilled. Do you remember how I said that they were both very spiritual people? Well, being part of the Dada movement and running the Cabaret Voltaire just wasn't nourishing them spiritually. So they decided to leave Zurich and to head into the Swiss mountains to live aesthetic and spiritual lives. And with those two out of the picture, Tristan Tzara quickly positioned himself as the new leader of the Dada movement. In 1918, a rich and well-connected man named Francis Picaba arrived in Zurich. Picaba was half French and half Cuban, but he spent most of his time between the art worlds of New York and Paris. Picaba had heard a lot about Zurich Dada, and he wanted to see it for himself. He was a painter himself, but he also published an art magazine named 391. Francis Picaba was spending more and more time at the Cabaret Voltaire, and he was beginning to write about Dadaism in his magazine. He wrote, "Art must be unaesthetic in the extreme, useless and impossible to justify." I'm introducing you to Francis Picaba because after spending time in Zurich, he went back to New York and he started conversing with the likes of Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray. And he was telling them about this really cool radical art movement coming out of Zurich called Dada, and about this idea of anti-art. And Marcel Duchamp was like, "Oh la la, that sounds very interesting, I might try some of that myself." And then Marcel Duchamp comes out with the ready-mades, which is basically this new concept where you don't have to make the art, you point at something that already exists in the world and you just go, that is now my art. You bring it into the gallery and it becomes your art. And Marcel Duchamp is most famous for going to a plumbing shop, buying a urinal, putting it on a plinth and declaring it his art. And that became probably the most famous piece of Dada art. I've made a whole video about Marcel Duchamp, so if you want to know a bit more about his career and his involvement in Dadaism, you can watch that video. Man Ray also responded to this new anti-art concept by making an artwork called The Gift. The Gift is an ironing board with spikes on it, and well, obviously this ironing board is useless because if you tried to use it, it would destroy your clothes rather than ironing them. So that's Man Ray's anti-art. And now, thanks to Francis Picaba, the Dada movement had become international. It's important to remember that the internet and Instagram did not exist back then. So if you were an artist in New York and you wanted to make Dada art, you didn't really have much to reference. Like, you would kind of have to just interpret the idea of anti-art in your own way, because you wouldn't have seen any examples of Zurich Dada. You might have heard of the idea of Dada art and anti-art, but there's no way that you could have spoken to any of the original Dadaists, and there's no way you could have seen any examples of Zurich Dada. And I think that's what I like about the Dada movement, is that each city really interprets Dadaism in its own way. The next stop on our Dada tour was Berlin, and the vibes were very different in Berlin. In New York and Zurich, Dada was rebellious and a bit outrageous, but in Berlin, Dada was much more hardcore and more political. This may have been because there was a literal revolution taking place all around them, and there was daily fighting in the streets. Dada arrived in Berlin in 1918, where the OG Dada poet, Richard Huelsenbeck, moved from Zurich to Berlin. Huelsenbeck arrived in Berlin, guns blazing. He quickly started making bold speeches about the nature of art and Dada and anti-art, and he openly insulted the German Expressionist movement, which was the dominant movement in Berlin at the time. Richard Huelsenbeck would go on to found the Club Dada, which, much like a Berlin nightclub, was a bit exclusive. Not everyone was welcome. It was a bit of a boys' club, and it seemed a bit toxic, to be honest. Anyway, let's meet some of the members of Club Dada. Johann Baader, famous for declaring himself the President of Germany, and then the President of the world. He was also known as the Oberdada, and he sincerely believed that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. So, you know, just a chill, down-to-earth guy. George Grosz. He was probably the most famous of the Berlin Dadaists. He was known for painting these political, caricature-y scenes of Berlin Weimar society. George Grosz was a communist until he visited the USSR. Upon returning, he declared that he hated communism. Apparently, at a dinner party, George Grosz once punched a man in the face because the man was praising the Soviet Union. Also, George Grosz hated women. He seemed like quite a miserable guy, to be honest. Raoul Hausmann. Raoul Hausmann was a very talented artist who worked across a range of different mediums and materials. Also, he had a really iconic look, and he was famous for wearing a monocle. He was most famous for making this sculpture called The Spirit of Our Time. It's a lifeless wooden head taken from a mannequin, and attached to the head are all sorts of tools and measurement devices. I think what this sculpture was trying to say is that humans have become lifeless workers who lack creativity or the ability to think for themselves, that we've become cogs in the machine. Raoul Haussmann also kind of wanted to be the leader of the Berlin Dadaists, so there was always a bit of tension between him and Richard Huelsenbeck. John Heartfield. Originally named Helmut Herzfeld, Heartfield decided to anglicise his name as an act of protest during World War I, when anti-English sentiment was sweeping Germany. John Heartfield is famous for making politicised collages with an anti-fascist, anti-Nazi twist. I really like his collages. I think they're really cool, and yeah, I just think they're sick. And finally, Hannah Hoch. Unfortunately, Hannah Hoch's contribution to Berlin Dada can sometimes be overlooked. This is because she was surrounded by narcissistic men. But Hannah Hoch played a central role in the development of something called the photo montage, which was basically a political style of collage which used newspapers and magazines as source material. Sometimes Hannah Hoch's photo montages were political, and sometimes they were just weird. Photo montage became Berlin Dada's signature style of art making. Unfortunately, the various members of Club Dada just couldn't get on with each other, and there were a few reasons for this. They basically all claimed to have invented the photo montage, and they bickered about it endlessly. They also couldn't agree politically. Some of them were socialists, and some of them were anti-communists who were pro-England and pro-USA. The only thing they could really agree on was that they hated authority and they hated the ruling class. And Richard Huelsenbeck, Raoul Haussmann, and Johann Baader all competed to be perceived as the leader of the Berlin Dada movement. Well, obviously that was going to cause some tension. And this really confuses me because being Dada is all about being anti-authority. So competing to be the leader of the Berlin Dada movement was the least Dada thing you could ever do. But that seemed to go right over their heads, to be honest with you. It's fair to say that Berlin Dada was here for a good time, not a long time. It peaked in 1920 when they hosted the first international Dada fair. And then they basically imploded from internal squabbling. But we can't leave Germany yet, because there's one more person who is very important to the story of Dadaism in Germany. So pack your bags, we're going to Hanover. But before we leave, I just want to take a moment to plug my Patreon. I make these videos on my own, and I do it around my regular job. As you can probably tell, these videos take a lot of research and a lot of effort, but it's also the thing I enjoy doing the most in the world. If you get value from my content, then please consider becoming a patron. For $5 or £4.50 a month, you can help me to continue making art educational content which is on the internet for anyone to access for free. If you can't afford it, fair enough, enjoy the content for free. But if you do get value from my content and if you can afford it, please consider becoming a patron. The link will be in the description to this video. And yeah, that's all. Thank you very much. Do you remember how I said that Club Dada was a bit exclusive? Well, Kurt Schwitters learnt that the hard way. He was an artist based in Hanover, but he was very connected to what was happening both in Zurich and in Berlin. So he was well aware of Dadaism and he was feeling very inspired by the Dada ideas. There was one problem. You know how Club Dada didn't like rich people and the ruling class? Well, Kurt Schwitters was basically like a very eccentric, posh man. And he was just a bit away with the fairies, shall we say. Anyway, Schwitters was a little bit oblivious to this, so he took a trip to Berlin in the hopes of being accepted into Club Dada. He first went to Richard Huelsenbeck, who said, absolutely not, go away. Then he decided he would try knocking on the door of George Groz's house, and allegedly George Groz slammed the door in his face. So Kurt Schwitters got double rejected and he went back to Hanover. But the thing is, Kurt Schwitters somehow still managed to become one of the most important figures in the history of Dada? Let me explain. Kurt Schwitters was a poet and a collage artist, but one day in his flat in Hanover, he decided to make his magnus opus. In his apartment, he built a column, and he started to treat this column like a collage, sticking things to it and transforming it over time. It became like a living sculpture, but slowly took over more and more of his apartment. He was bringing in junk off the street and including it to his creation until his whole apartment had become a living sculpture. Did I mention that Kurt Schwitters was a landlord? Well, he was. And he owned the flat above his own. Anyway, legend has it that Kurt Schwitters evicted his upstairs neighbours so that he could make a hole in his roof and he could continue building his column up into the upstairs flat. Now, that's not cool. And that makes me think maybe Club Dada rejected him for good reason. When the Nazis came to power, Kurt Schwitters had to flee Germany. This is because the Nazis considered him to be a cultural Bolshevik. They didn't like modern art. And what Kurt Schwitters was doing was, well, it wasn't classical art. Schwitters first fled to Norway, and then he fled to the UK. And unfortunately, he had to leave his masterpiece behind because it was literally attached to his house. Even more unfortunately, his house was destroyed by an Allied bomb during World War II. So this artwork is no more. You can't visit it. But the legend of Kurt Schwitters and his weird collaged house thing lives on. Now that I've told Kurt Schwitters' story, we can move on to the final chapter of this story. The final chapter of Dadaism took place in Paris. Paris was the cultural epicenter of the world at that time. Dadaism had already made a name for itself in Zurich, New York, and Berlin. Paris was kind of like the final boss. Something you have to know about Parisian Dada was that it was mostly a movement of poets. The Parisian painters never really took to Dada in the same way. But in this video, I'm not going to go into too much detail about Dada poetry because honestly, it's just not my strength. What I am going to do is I'm going to tell you about the Paris Dada scene, the politics of it, and how Dada basically died its death in Paris. Do you remember Francis Picaba? He was the guy who brought Dada from Zurich to New York. Well, he was now living in Paris. And he was talking about Dada, bigging up Dada to all his Parisian poet friends, including someone called André Breton, who would go on to lead the Surrealist movement. So Parisians were becoming curious about this movement from Dada that they were hearing about from New York, from Berlin, and from Zurich. And hype started to build because Tristan Tzara, the leader of Zurich Dada, had announced that he was going to move to Paris. And then one day in the middle of the night, Tristan Tzara arrives in Paris unannounced and he heads over to Francis Picaba's apartment, knocks on the door unexpected and asks if he can stay over for the night. And with that, Dadaism reached Paris. A few months later, Paris had its first Dada exhibition that included paintings by the likes of Juan Gris, Giorgio de Chirico and Francis Picaba. It also featured a manifesto reading from Tristan Tzara. The Parisians were blown away. They'd never seen anything like it, and they responded by rioting. The Parisian Dadaists were delighted with this outcome, and they promptly organised more exhibitions and more readings, which more often than not would end in rioting. Over the next couple of months, this guy, André Breton, would become more and more involved in Dada. He started reading and writing his own manifestos at Dada events. Now, that was kind of weird because André Breton, he didn't fit in with the Dada vibe. Most of the Dadaists were like a bit chaotic and a bit anarchistic-y, whereas André Breton was very organised and quite ambitious. He was a bit bossy, and according to some people, he had absolutely no sense of humour. If you watched my video on Frida Kahlo, You may remember that Frida Kahlo did not like André Breton. In fact, she referred to him as a cockroach. So just bear that in mind. Anyway, it wasn't long before André Breton was competing with Tristan Tzara to be the leader of the Parisian Dadaists. Paris Dada peaked on the 20th of May 1920 at the Salle Gaveau Theatre. It was advertised that the Dadaists were going to have their hair shaved off. Unfortunately, there are no photographs of this event, so I'm just going to have to explain it to you. On the stage was André Breton, and he was holding a revolver to his head. The crowd had brought tomatoes, and as Breton was having his head shaved with a revolver pointed to his head, the crowd started throwing tomatoes at him. Like that. As you can imagine, the whole thing ended in a riot like it always did, and the venue was wrecked. But despite the wrecked venue, the Parisian Dadaists had succeeded in creating a success de scandal. The event was condemned by a number of Parisian newspapers. But this event is important because it really finally put Dada on the map in Paris. But now the Parisian Dadaists had a problem. You see, before they'd kind of been relying on shock and scandal. But at this point, all the Parisian public, they'd seen it all. There was nothing that could shock them. It had all been done. And without their main weapon of shock and scandal, the Paris Dada movement kind of started to lose momentum. And as we all know, everyone can get on fine if the movement is going well. But when the movement starts losing momentum, people start turning on each other. And that's exactly what happened with the Paris Dadaists. André Breton publicly insulted Tristan Tzara in a French newspaper, calling him an interloper from Zurich and a publicity-seeking imposter. And from here, the group splinters. On the one hand was André Breton, who believed Dada was in a rut because it was too anarchistic and chaotic, and he believed the only way forward was for Dada to introduce some hierarchy and some order. On the other hand was Tristan Tzara, who was never going to compromise on his old school Zurich Dada values. For him, Dada could never be ordered or hierarchical. Because it was Dada, it was supposed to be anti-order and anti-hierarchy. And then Tristan Tzara did something very cunning and unexpected. He convened something called the Congress of Paris, which was an opportunity for the Dada movement to do something it had never done before. All sit down together and have a rational conversation about who their leader should be and what the way forward looks like. Throughout the Congress, André Breton was taking things very seriously. He'd written down his arguments, he'd rehearsed them well, and he was delivering them convincingly. Whereas Tristan Tzara was kind of acting ridiculous, and he was making progress impossible because he kept doing silly things. If this was any normal Congress, André Breton would have won because he made clear arguments that made sense. However, this was Dadaism, and in some ways Tristan Tzara had laid a trap, because Dada was anti-progress, it was anti-authority, it was anti-order. And what the Congress of Paris showed the members of Dada was that André Breton didn't really get Dadaism. He was a little bit too authoritarian. He was a bit too controlling, and he was a bit too, he wanted to be in charge a bit too much. So the Congress actually sided with Tristan Tzara, who was being silly, over André Breton. And despite the fact that Dadaism had now purged itself of André Breton, it was still in a state of decline. This was made even more clear when Francis Picaba dropped out of Dadaism and realigned himself with André Breton and the emerging Surrealist movement. Over the next couple of months and years, more and more artists would drop out of Dadaism or just kind of disappear into the background. They say it's better to burn out than to fade away. But Paris Dada kind of faded away. I think the Dada artist and historian Walter Mehring said it best when he said, There was no point continuing because nobody could any longer see the point. So born in Zurich during the Great War, Dadaism spread far and wide to cities such as Paris, Berlin and New York. It stood against art, against rationality and against the ruling class. It swept up some of the most important artists of the 20th century, and it gave us so many new ways to make art, such as the photo montage, the ready-made and the phonetic poem. And out of the ashes of Dadaism came a new movement, arguably an even more significant one, called Surrealism. And I plan to make a video on Surrealism soon, so if you want to watch it, like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you making it to the end. See you next time.